Okay, so today I am going to discuss this idea of the reemergence out of the desert. So just so I can think through this and get back to here, our first my first lecture was covering the basics of human perception. The second lecture was about the call to the hero's journey that now is insufficient. The third lecture was, let's see, going into the desert, so into the wilderness, wandering and trying to find your way, fighting the dragon of chaos, facing the unknown. And then the last lecture, or sorry, lecture four, was about having faith and hope and maintaining faith and hope through all of that. And the last lecture was about the hero and the adversary. And so now I want to talk about the group, and I want to talk about the group either accepting or rejecting the hero and the new knowledge that he just expressed. And so I'm going to talk about the group, and then I'm going to talk about the stranger. And so the group is like the uh, it's a civilization, it's a town, and they are symbolic or they embody the tradition. So what you have with children who are 2 years old and under, they aren't really that social usually, at least under two. And so they play by themselves and they imitate their parents mostly and they imitate themselves. But when they get older, they go and they socialize with others and they have to learn how to socialize with others. And they end up forming groups. And they form groups by playing with other children, and they sort of establish this pattern like thing. They establish a tradition, they get to know somebody, they understand them, and they're able to predict what they're going to do. And once they're predictable, then you can become friends, right? You cannot become friends necessarily with, or at least you don't want to become friends with someone who's constantly changing and who you'll never be able to truly understand because they're always going to change their identity. And so people form a group and they form a tradition, and they understand one another, and so it's this embodiment of order, and this embodiment of predictability. And so fundamentally what a group is it's a collection of people who, at least to a degree, know each other, or they are united under some ethos. So you have the church, and that's a group of people, and ideally they're all united under Christ. That's supposed to be how the church is. And then you have other groups. You have like the government, and so they're united ideally under keeping the government well and strong, and keeping its purpose alive, which ideally is to serve the people. And then you have Democrats and Republicans, and the Republicans are united under their party and their set of beliefs, and the Democrats under theirs. And I think you can kind of see that all groups have a united ethos. They have an identity, and that identity is very important to them because it's what keeps their group as it is. It's what keeps the group as the group that it was meant to be and that it originally was. And so it's also the establishment of this tradition. And so you can imagine you have a group of football players, and they like to play football together, and they go and they practice every Thursday or something like that. And just to use Thursday for an example, and imagine one of the football players comes up to another, or let's say the group leader, and he goes up to him and he says, "Hey, I want to invite my friend. He's not a football player. He actually plays the guitar." And So, um, you know, it, I'm coming here to ask you if it's okay if we have our friend, and he'll just sit on the bench or something, and he'll play the guitar, while we go and play football. And they say, okay, yeah, it's fine. It's good to let a little bit of chaos into the group. It's good to shake the identity a little bit. Um, but let's say there's 20 football players and there's one guitarist. Well, I mean, it's still fundamentally a football team, but imagine then you have someone who plays the violin, and then someone who plays the piano, and then someone who plays the drums, and someone who plays the piano. And so now you have 5 people who are playing music, and only 20 people who are playing football. And then so it's like, well, at that point, are you a football group now, or are you a football and a music group? And then imagine now there are 15 more people come who are in the band, and so now it's 20 football players and 20 people who are playing music. And so at that point it's like, well, it's no longer really a football team anymore. And so that group actually loses its identity, because it's let chaos in, and maybe it's let too much chaos in. And then you can imagine, of course, that if there was 30 or if there was 40 or 50 people who were playing instruments, then it would practically be a band and not a football team anymore. And so you can see the more chaos you let in, the more new information you bring in, the less the group maintains its original identity. And so you can imagine you can have a adversarial um, group who lets no chaos in whatsoever, and who only maintains their original identity and isn't willing to change at all. And then you can imagine the group that never sticks to an identity and constantly lets new people in, and they lose their identity as a consequence, and they are forever changing because they're letting everybody in. And then eventually you let so many people in that your group is actually just called the people of the world, right? So it's just called humanity, because you've let all the chaos in. And so you can imagine, now this idea of the foreigner, or the foreign nation, or the stranger, right? So this the stranger is this guy who's unknown to the group, and who potentially, also poses a threat. And so the stranger is also, in this sense, is a manifestation of chaos, because they're the unknown. And but they also they bring with them the potential for group identity transformation, and maybe that could be, a positive transformation, but it also has a chance of being a negative transformation. And so that negative change is what we see constantly laid out through the Old Testament and the Bible. We constantly see that God tells the Israelites not to go and worship the false gods of other nations. And this is, I would say, famously exemplified in King Solomon. So you have King Saul was the first king of Israel, and then you had King David after him, and King David's son was Solomon. And now, so Solomon was the wisest man in the Bible, and maybe even the wisest man, and well, at least the wisest man in the Old Testament. And Solomon falls into a temptation. He goes and he marries 700 wives from foreign nations to try and have an agreement with them, and to try and make peace with them. And so he accepts all of this information, all of this chaos, all this potential from other nations. But again, he has 700 wives. And so he begins to worship these nations' false gods. He begins to worship their false identities. And because of that, he um, I forget what exactly Solomon's punishment is, but I think it's that his dynasty won't be established into the future. I'm not sure if that's correct, but um, that is laid out in the biblical narrative as one of Solomon's greatest flaws, is that he allows too much chaos in, he allows too much change, too much group identity change, and he allows all the false gods to come in, all the false identities, and because of that, he falls prey to false worship, and the kingdom of Israel is now sinful, and God's anger burns against them. And so now I kind of want to go into this idea of a hierarchy. And so at the top of a hierarchy, you have the identity, the group identity. Um, so that would be for Israel, that would be the Lord God, Yahweh, or maybe he's even beyond that hierarchy. And at the bottom, you have the multiplicity, and all of that's pointing up towards the hierarchy, and it's subjugated to the top. All the bottom things are serving the top, but also the top is serving the bottom. So it's this idea of reciprocity, right? So that's what Christ says in the New Testament. He goes to his disciples and he washes their feet, and he tells them that he's gonna wash. He goes to Peter specifically, and he says that he's going to wash Peter's feet. And Peter's like, no, 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 you're my Lord, you're my master. I'm not. I can't let you. Can't wash my feet because you're beyond me. You have authority over me. You're my master. You're my king. I'm your servant. Why would you do such a thing? And Christ says, I am indeed your master, and you are indeed my servant, something like that. And but he says, um, unless I wash your feet, you have no part in me. And so it's this idea. Christ says elsewhere in the New Testament, he says, whoever wishes to be the master of all must be the servant of all. And so it's that idea of reciprocity. And so in the ideal hierarchy, where everything is subjugated under the proper identity, which would be something approximating God, God serves the lower level hierarchies. And so false worship occurs whenever things at the lower level of the hierarchy are subjugated, or sorry, whenever things at the lower levels of the hierarchy are put above where they should be, and even worse, when things are brought up to the very top, to the place of God, and they are worshipped as a false god. So that's a lot of what you see in the Old Testament, is you see this false worship of gods that they sort of exist, right? I mean, you have the god of nature. I mean, nature exists. I mean, of course, you can say that nature isn't a god, and God isn't in the nature, and I would agree with that. But it isn't like these false gods necessarily don't exist, right? I mean, they exist, but they should be properly subjugated to the one true God, the creator God of heaven and earth. And so again, nature isn't God. Like the spirit of anger isn't God. These things aren't gods. Um, maybe they're gods in the lowercase god sense, right? They're spirits, like anger and lust and greed. These things are spirits that possess us, and so they're beyond us. They're not us, and so they're spirits. They're demons. They're spiritual. They have this divine-ish element, and whenever those are worshipped in the highest place, then you then things go terribly wrong, and things collapse very rapidly. And so that's the idea of this hierarchy. And so the group sort of establishes this hierarchy. They put something at the top, and they worship that, and they subjugate all lower things to the top. And what the stranger does is the stranger comes and he provides new information that could potentially affect this hierarchy of value. And so I suppose this is sort of an expansion upon this idea of human perception and assigning meaning to value in things. Well, yes, we assign meaning and value to things, but some things are more valuable than other things. And so you have this hierarchy, and you can ask yourself, well, what's at the very top, and what's what's most meaningful to you is what you worship, or at least you worship the spirit of that thing. And God is ultimately the spirit of goodness itself and the good. So he's the spirit of love, the spirit of truth, the spirit of life, all of these good things, the spirit of blessings. But he's also beyond being itself. So in that sense, he's beyond the hierarchy. He's beyond the top. He's outside of it. He's outside of categorization, right? Because that's one of the things you're doing whenever you have a hierarchy, is you're actually categorizing things, right? You're sort of naming and subduing things. You're putting them in their proper place, right? You're subduing, putting them in their proper place. You're aligning them with something. You're always doing that. You always have a hierarchy, and there's sort of this idea in the modern world that hierarchies are, the traditional patriarchal oppressive systems established by mankind, but that actually isn't true. We see with other animals, we see hierarchies, and these hierarchies, they're not dominance hierarchies. They aren't, might makes right hierarchies. And we see this with people very clearly, but we see these with I believe apes. We see that it isn't necessarily always the strongest ape that's at the top of the hierarchy, although it sometimes is. Sometimes you see very small, usually male, but very small apes at the top of a hierarchy, and it's because they express the mode of being of reciprocity, right? It isn't about might makes right. It's about storing. What would you say? It's about this idea of uh, reputation, right? Storing up treasure and in the future in this form of reputation, so people can trust you. People can trust that that they can make an agreement with you, that they can understand you, and by understanding you, they can trust you and they can work with you as a partner in the future. And that trust is like a wealth beyond that of the material wealth that we may store up. And so it's the wealth that cannot be destroyed, and it's the wealth that's eternal, and it's stored in the minds of individuals and not in bank vaults. And that the idea there is actually that wealth supersedes material wealth. And it supersedes material wealth because material wealth can run out, right? It can be depleted. It can be stolen. It can be subject to moth and rust, and it can be destroyed. But material, but spiritual wealth stored in reputation, stored in the minds of other people, is a wealth that never goes away, and it's a wealth that puts you at the top of a hierarchy. And so this hierarchy, again, it isn't this might makes right. It isn't fighting your way up the hierarchy and dominating others and people out of fear or maybe respect. They put you at the top. No, they put the people who they can trust at the top. And that's very, very important. And so the idea of a hierarchy, firstly, is necessary for human perception, because what you put at the top, you sacrifice the bottom things for. And so you always have a hierarchy, and so you're always sacrificing things. And so one way that you can understand a hierarchy is simply by looking at understanding your vision. So whenever I'm looking at the camera, I don't see all the other things in my room. They're actually quite blurred out. And right here, I can barely see things. They're actually black and white right here. I can only detect motion right here, not actual color, and that's because I need to see motion. Color is a beautiful thing, but it's secondary to understanding what's there. And then behind me, I can't see anything. And so it gets clearer, 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 clearer focus right here, and I can even squint my eyes and hyper focus on one point. And so what I'm doing by looking at this camera is I'm sacrificing looking at everything out, and the further it goes out, the further toward the bottom of the hierarchy it goes out, the more of it I'm sacrificing, and I'm completely sacrificing those things that are behind me. Of course, I have a camera right here and I can see behind me, but imagine if I was looking over here, I'm sacrificing everything behind me. I can't see it. And so with every single glance, you're actually making a sacrifice and you're actually organizing things in terms of meaning and a hierarchy. And so there's nothing bad about a hierarchy. Now, hierarchies can go wrong. You can have a bad hierarchy, but the nature or the essence of a hierarchy itself is not inherently evil. Okay. So now I want to talk about the group willfully accepting the stranger or the hero. So I like to start off with talking about the transformation that's taken place within the hero himself. And so if it's truly if it's truly the hero's journey, then that transformation is going to be a positive transformation. And it's going to be positive because what the hero so this is going to be a slight overview. What the hero has done is he's made a sacrifice, and it's a psychological sacrifice. So he sacrificed part of himself, and because of that, he went to the desert because again his frame of perception collapsed. Meaning collapsed, the value system collapsed, that hierarchy collapsed. And it got dispersed out into the desert, and he had to reconstruct a new value hierarchy, a new tradition, a new mode of being that was capable and that was adapted to face that desert, that new information. And because of that, he came out of the desert transformed and for the better. And so again, what the hero did was he rejected a value hierarchy. He rejected a tradition, and very often that tradition has most of its foundation in a society, in the environment around him. And so he imitated others, and then he was able to understand through imitation and through dialogue with others. He was able to understand that tradition, and then once he was able to understand it, he was able to then follow the spirit of the law through the desert and transform it. Now, whenever he transforms, he has not yet transformed others unless they've also come on that same journey. And so he then has to go back to the group, and he tells the group what it is that he's learned, or the new mode of being, the new knowledge, the new discovery, and that group can either accept it with joy and they can all transform for the better, or they can reject it harshly, and then they're then subjugated to becoming a victim, a so-called victim, even though it's their fault. They're subjugated to being devoured by that new information and that new dragon that they are not willing to accept and face. And so you might say, well, why would the group reject transformation? Why would they reject, especially positive transformation? Why would they reject that? And the thing is that when the hero goes through his journey and he transforms, it isn't like he goes back to the group and he tells them what he's learned, and he shows them what he's learned, the new information or the new mode of being or whatever it may be, and they just accept it immediately, and then all is merry. The group itself, each individual, but also as a whole, also has to go through that journey. Now maybe it's easier because they've already been told the lesson, but when you get told new information, what you do if you accept it is you lose that mode of being. It goes down and it reconstructs itself in what would you say, in compliance or in congruency with that new piece of information that's been received. Now again, that transformation of the original tradition, that tradition hasn't changed much. Very often your frame of perception won't change that much. But the whole thing will collapse and reconstruct itself. Well, you'll have to reconstruct it, but it'll be reconstructed, and it will integrated. That's a better word. It'll have integrated that new information, and because of that, you become less ignorant, and the group becomes less ignorant, and that positive transformation allows the group and the hero collectively to fall into less pits, and that cycle repeats itself and repeats itself and repeats itself. And so I guess a great example in modern history of the whole world accepting a new piece of information and it transforming the whole world is this idea of slavery. And we can even go, maybe I think this is a more recent transformation, this idea of traditional gender roles, saying that women should work in the house and men should go out and work. And of course, there were reasons for that. What you have to understand with these traditional gender roles is that our society is the exception, right? So men and women both have the opportunity to go and work, but maybe not a few hundred years ago, but thousands and 10,000s of years ago, you had to have these traditional gender roles. They were necessary because of the harsh conditions of life, and so we're living in that in that exceptional state, that our world is completely different from that of 100, 200, especially a few thousand years ago. And so, but slavery and these gender roles, these are quite large transformations, and at least the slavery one happened worldwide, but the traditional gender role, I think, at least happened in the West. I don't know about most of Europe. I imagine it has to a degree, but I don't know that for sure. And so we can see that the world at large, has accepted this transformation. Um, and that happened worldwide, and that was a positive transformation. Now, there's also an example in the Bible, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, of the group or a particular civilization accepting the truth, repenting, and transforming to the better, for the better. And that's the story of Jonah. Jonah is a really good story to use, talking about the hero's journey. It represents it very well. I think it's trying to get at this idea of the death and resurrection, or the hero's journey. This descent into the desert, or the heart of the earth, or to hell itself, and this reemergence on a higher mountain, or firmer ground. And so what Jonah does, God comes to Jonah, and again he tells him, um, and so Jonah is an Israelite, and one of the biggest enemies during this time, or maybe even the biggest enemy at the time of Jonah, was the Ninevites. And God comes to Jonah as the voice of conscience, so that's Jonah's calling. And God comes to him and he says, I want you to go to Nineveh, your biggest enemy, and I want you to go and face them and face that dragon. And I want you to tell them that because of their sins and their wickedness, that I am going to destroy their city. And Jonah says, absolutely not. I'm not going to go do that. And he literally goes the opposite direction. And then he goes into a boat, and then he goes into the water, and then he goes into a well, the belly of the well. And then that well takes him all the way down to the depths of the sea. So he literally goes down into hell itself. But this time, well, actually, he does so voluntarily, at least from being thrown into the water. He accepts it, and he willfully goes in there. And then while he's in the belly, he repents. And when he gets out, the well spits him up on dry land, and he goes to the city of Nineveh. And his sermon is literally, I think it's a few Hebrew words. And it says, and all he says is, God's going to destroy Nineveh in 40 days. because of their sins and wickedness. And the Ninevites go, "Oh no, this is terrible. This is awful. Maybe if we repent, then the structure of reality is built in such a way that if we repent and we turn away from our wicked ways, then God is going to reward us by not destroying our city." And that's exactly what happens. And so we see that when the group willfully accepts the truth, that they are positively transformed. But we also see the opposite case being made in the case of the Israelites. And so I guess that this is kind of one of the ways that that the Old Testament isn't just Israelite dogmatic propaganda. And one of the reasons that you can tell that is because the Israelites are not given a very good picture in the Old Testament. In fact, quite the contrary. They are labeled as a rebellious nation, a nation that's constantly going to exile, constantly worshiping false gods, and constantly abandoning their covenant with God, constantly sacrificing to false idols, and all those terrible things, all those sins against God. And so what happens to them is that God sends a bunch of prophets. So again, that's that prophetic voice, that voice of consciousness comes to the Israelites and those prophets tell them, look, God's going to send you into exile if you don't repent and turn to him and start worshiping him and start fulfilling his covenant again, that promise that you made with him. Remember that promise. Go and worship the one true creator God. And every time the Israelites reject God and they turn to false worship, so they subjugate God to the lower level things in the hierarchy and put the lower level things at the top, which is basically false worship. They go into exile. And so essentially, right, again, these other nations, they're strangers, they're foreign, they're the unknown. And so because of that, they're sort of consumed by the dragon. They essentially go to hell, at least a manifestation of hell on earth. And every single time it's because of false worship. It's because they take something at the lower level of the value hierarchy and they move it to the top, and or even the very top, and because of that they go to hell. They are exiled and their enemies conquer them and enslave them and all of those things. And so they effectively, every time they perform false worship, they go back to Egypt, essentially, right? And so what these prophets are doing is they are calling the Israelites to repent, right? The prophets are the heroes. Symbolically, there are the heroes that have received a divine revelation from God and they've accepted it themselves. And they go to the Israelites, they go to the group, they go to the town, to the village of which they were from, and they go and they tell them the new information. And most of the time, at least in the case of the Israelites reject that, and because of that they either stay in exile or they go to exile in the first place. And so that is effectively the hero's journey, in terms of the hero himself, and in terms of the return home, and the response to the group. But I want to kind of think through for a second this idea of the prophets, right? So Christ, there's a parable in the New Testament that Christ uses, and he says that there's a vineyard, and the master went off on I think it's like a vacation sort of thing, and he left some of his servants to tend the vineyard, and there were some evil strangers, let's say, on the outside, And they said, "Oh, look, the master's gone. Let's go and kill his servants and, take from his vineyard." And then the master's like, "Oh no, my servants died. Okay, well, I'm going to go send more servants." And then they get killed, and more servants, and they get stoned, and more servants, and they get beat and abused. And he's like, "Okay, well, finally, I'll send my son. And, surely they'll leave my vineyard alone for his sake." And then it says, but the wicked men saw his son and said, "Oh, look, this is the master's son. Let us go and kill him and take his inheritance." And so, of course, that's aimed at the Pharisees, right? Right, the religious hypocrites, um, who proclaim with their lips, but their hearts are far from God. Um, and so Christ is sort of making a mockery of them, but it's also this parable that's referring, so the servants of the vineyard are the prophets, the evil men are the Pharisees, or the hypocritical religious leaders, and the master is God the Father. And so what Christ is referring to is he's referring to this religious hypocrisy where the Pharisees or the priest or the leaders, and the lawyers, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are religious hypocrites, and they're actually killing the prophets. So they're rejecting the stranger. They're killing off, the mouthpieces of God's voice, the people through whom God is speaking. They're killing that prophetic voice, and they're therefore rejecting, the possibility that there's something that they don't know. And so because of that, Christ says this parable. Now, what we have to see in this hero's journey is we have to see that we can be both the prophetic voice through which God speaks, but we can also be the Pharisees, or we can be the rejectors of the new information. We can be both the hero and we can be the adversary. And so we have to ask ourselves, we have to look at these stories like Christ and Satan, or Christ and the Pharisees, or Cain and Abel, or the Israelites and the prophets, and we have to ask ourselves, which character exactly am I in this story? And so maybe you're a little bit of both, and that's at least true. You're at least some of both, of course, because if you accepted, all this transformation at once, then, you would transform so rapidly that maybe you would just like die or something, right? And so one of the things that we see with the law is we see with the Old Testament and the progression through the prophets, and then in the New Testament, and then in the letters of Paul, we actually see this progression of the law. One such example of this is we see in the Old Testament there is a law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And we might see that in light of the New Testament, of what Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount, and we might say, well, that's a very harsh law. But what you have to understand is that the Israelites, their law was substantially better than any of the laws around them. And so one way that you can understand the Mosaic law is we shouldn't be comparing that law that's 3,000 years old, or maybe even older. We shouldn't be comparing that to a law that's 3,000 years later, after the New Testament, after Christ, and after the tradition has been tested, and after new things have been manifested. We shouldn't compare those laws, and instead we should compare the Mosaic law to the surrounding laws. And what we see is that it is way better, right? And so, hypothetically, in some of the cultures, there was a law that if I were to slap you, then you could kill me. Or if I was to steal something from you, then you, could kill me. Or, um, you know, uh, I think this is even still the case, but it was actually quite recently still the case. If you were to steal someone, then you would have your hand cut off. And so in light of those surrounding laws, which were around during that time, you can understand that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that's being very generous. That is quite a substantial improvement from the other surrounding laws. And then Christ brings us even further in the New Testament, with this idea, you have heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, but I say unto you, whoever or do not resist the evil one, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Whoever would sue you for your tunic, give him your cloak as well. And whoever would force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. And and so, of course, you can imagine that if that law in the New Testament, that updated version of the law, if that was in the Old Testament, that would have been so radical that maybe the Israelites wouldn't have even been able to follow it. And so the question isn't, is God like evil because he didn't reveal the perfect manifestation of the law, like the absolute perfect manifestation of the law? And I would say no, because maybe we can't handle that level of transformation. Maybe it's too rapid, it's too significant of a transformation for us to genuinely undergo. And I would say that even the laws that we have now, a lot of them are very, very difficult, right? Be therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. These laws are very difficult to follow. And so what you have to do is you have to take them one step at a time. And that's that being poor in spirit, right? Christ says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So it isn't, take on all the responsibility. It's take on as much responsibility as you can handle. So that's blessed are the poor in spirit. So do what you can handle, do no more, and do no less, right? And so that's the idea of blessed are the poor in spirit. Okay, I'm gonna end off this lecture there. Just a quick reminder. The next lecture is going to be about the eternal pattern of the hero. So how this propagates, and I'm going to sort of bring this into Christianity. And then the last lecture is going to be over the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.